Hello and welcome back to part 17 of why the pre-tribulation rapture is a false doctrine. In this video, we will continue to look at the false claims made by some modern pre-tribulationist teachers that the early church and the church fathers supposedly were teaching a pre-tribulational rapture. So far, we have discussed the church fathers Irenaeus, Victorinus, Cyprian, Cyril of Jerusalem, and others, and have proven that they were all post-tribulational. They believed and taught that Jesus would return after the tribulation and before the bowls of wrath, according to Matthew chapter 24, 29 through 31. In this video, we're going to correct some of the false claims of a pre-trib teacher named Lee Brainerd and others. Lee Brainerd has claimed to find some pre-tribulational statements in the writings of Eusebius, the church historian. So let's take a look at what this church father Eusebius of Caesarea believed about the timing of the rapture. Eusebius of Caesarea, as he was known, lived from 260 to 339 AD. He was also known as Eusebius Pamphilius. He was a historian of Christianity, exegete, and Christian polemicist. In about AD 314, he became the bishop of Caesarea in the Roman province of Syria. He was a scholar of the biblical canon and is regarded as one of the most learned Christians during late antiquity. So we're going to look at the claims of author and pre-trib teacher Lee Brainerd in this video. He is a strong believer in the pre-tribulational rapture, and he knows Old Greek. So as part of his pastime, what he does is he pulls up various documents that are most often published, or they've been published in more recent years in the original Latin or Greek on a website. Anyone can go to this website and look at these, and if you have the tools or the knowledge, you can translate them into English. So what Lee has done is he has gone through a lot of these previously untranslated fragments in different texts, and he claims to have found a whole host of pre-tribulational statements made by Eusebius. So we're going to see if that's actually true. Now here's a short quote from Lee Brainerd here from an interview he had. He was on a show with Nathan Jones of Lamb and Lion Ministries. Now in the interview, they talk about Lee Brainerd kind of being like an Indiana Jones kind of person, finding these ancient documents in the basements of old churches, and he's translating them and this type of thing. And it sounds all very exciting, but really all he's doing is he's going on the website of Roger Pierce, pulling out some of these fragments and different documents and translating them. It all sounds very exciting and it catches people's attention, but that's not the reality of it at all, as we will see. Here Lee Brainerd claims that once again yet another church father wrote about his expectation of the end times regarding the timing of the rapture. He claims to have found a statement in Eusebius's commentary on the book of Luke which teaches a pre-tribulational rapture, according to him. Here's what Lee Brainerd had to say in this interview, and I quote. He says, so let's dive into exactly what Eusebius had to say. Well, for instance, let's just look at the first one here. In fact, I'm going to look at number 2 here. Eusebius fragments in Luke is a commentary on Luke chapter 17, verse 26, one of our very favorite rapture passages in the modern evangelical church. As all perished, except those gathered with Noah in the ark, so also at his coming, the ungodly in the season of apostasy shall perish, while according to the pattern of Noah, all the righteous and godly are to be separated from the ungodly and gathered into the heavenly ark. For in this way comes a time when not even one righteous man will be found any more amongst mankind, and when all the godly have been made atheists by the Antichrist, and the whole world is overcome by apostasy, the wrath of God shall come upon the ungodly. End quote. So that's what Lee Brainerd had to say there. He reads this quote from Eusebius, then he talks about the order of events that Eusebius lays out. Now there's a few significant problems that we need to address here. The first problem here is the first quote that Lee just read doesn't exist. I don't know that this was deliberate at all. In fact, I'm willing to bet just about anything that it was a careless and really sloppy mistake. Essentially what you have here is a quote, and I'm going to show you some pictures that is actually a quote that is a composite of various things that Eusebius said, cutting out large portions and not telling us that that's what they've done in order to create the appearance of a single statement, which again, if you're just reading it without looking at the broader context of what Eusebius said, you might say, oh wow, that looks like a clearly pre-tribulational proof text. And this is really the power of confirmation bias. However, Lee Brainerd's claims here are easy to debunk. This is not a pre-tribulational statement made by Eusebius. It's unarguable, as you will see here shortly. What Lee Brainerd did here is he took Eusebius's larger statement, highlighted sections, and sort of put it together, and you'll actually see it on his website. That's what he's done, and then he highlights the parts that seem to support a pre-tribulation rapture, and then he jams them all together, and then here on the TV show, he reads it as though it's an actual whole uninterrupted statement, and that's how it's presented. But that statement doesn't exist. It's made up of pieces that are chopped out of Eusebius's larger statement and put together as though it's one statement. But the statement, again, it doesn't exist that way. So here's a picture of that clip that Lee Brainerd mentioned in his statement presented in this interview. You'll notice that there's no little ellipses, the ... That's usually what you see legally when you're writing and publishing and this sort of thing. It's expected or ethically expected to do when you quote somebody. There should be a separation here from this statement and some space until you get to the next statement. This is what was presented in the interview, and it's presented as one single statement. Now what I've done here, as you can see, is I've put Eusebius's original statement on the left, and then I've put Lee Brainerd's pasted version of it on the right, and I've highlighted the correlating portions, of course, in red, blue, and yellow. So again, on the left you can see the actual statement, and on the right you see Lee Brainerd's version, and you can see these large sections that he's cut out. But on this TV show interview in the video, there's no reference to it at all. So it's not just sloppy, careless work, it's very misleading to present information this way. So the statement here in this interview, the quote itself that's presented by Lee Brainerd on this TV show, it doesn't exist. It's made up. He completely made it up and pasted it together. So the statement, the quote itself that is presented by Lee Brainerd on this show, it doesn't exist. Okay, so here's the full quote of Eusebius's commentary on Luke. We're going to read quite a bit here because this is important. This is what Bereans do. You can't just pull a statement out of context and say, aha, look at this is pre-trib. You have to read the totality, at least the surrounding context of what the individual is trying to say. This is responsible. As a teacher, it is our obligation, our responsibility to do this. Okay, so Eusebius here, he says in his commentary, as was stated, he, Jesus, says that the destruction of the wicked will take place like it did for those who lived at the time of the flood, since the message of the gospel had been driven out due to their apostasy. Indeed, just as he destroyed all people then, except those who had gone with Noah into the ark, so too at his coming he will shut out and destroy, as in the days of Noah, the ungodly and unfaithful. As was stated, he is referring to what Jesus says, that the destruction of the wicked will take place like it did for those who lived at the time of the flood. So he's talking about the time of Noah. Now, pre-tribbers use Noah frequently as a historical sort of pattern or type for the rapture, and it says since the message of the gospel had been driven out due to their apostasy. In other words, since the message concerning righteousness in the earth had largely disappeared, because there was so much rebellion and apostasy, he says indeed, just as he destroyed all people. So during the time of the flood, he destroyed everyone except for a few righteous, those who had gone into Noah's ark. So too at his coming he will shut out and destroy, as in the days of Noah, the ungodly and the unfaithful. So the question here is, what does Eusebius mean by his coming? Now again, as always, I would argue that there's only one coming. Jesus comes, he returns at the end of the tribulation. Pre-tribulationalism has to by necessity teach that there are two more comings of Christ, sort of an invisible coming for his church, and then another coming with his church. So they teach there are two more comings, but of course the Bible doesn't teach that anywhere in Scripture. Here Eusebius is talking about his coming. Pre-tribbers would say, well, that's talking about the rapture before the tribulation, whereas I would argue that Eusebius knows of no such thing. But the point is, Eusebius uses the term his coming. The Scriptures only refer to one coming of the Lord, not comings plural. It only knows of one coming of the Lord, one appearing of the Lord. Now let's move on to the next statement. As we'll see, and this is so important, Eusebius specifically says, the wrath of God is fire and brimstone that will be poured out on the wicked after Jesus returns. Notice he says that the wrath of God is fire and brimstone that will be poured out when? After Jesus returns. This is so critical, and this statement alone, it completely debunks what Lee Brainerd's trying to claim here in his interview about the pre-tribulational rapture. So let's take a look at what Eusebius said here in his commentary. He says, just as it happened in the days of Lot, they were eating, drinking, etc. But on the day that Lot left Sodom, he rained fire from heaven and destroyed everyone. It will be the same on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. He thereby teaches that unspeakably terrible wrath will come upon all the wicked as fire and brimstone sent from heaven, end quote. So first he talks about Noah, now he's talking about Lot. But on the day that Lot left Sodom, he rained fire from heaven and destroyed everyone. So the Lord rained down fire on Sodom. It will be the same on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And what does the word revealed mean? Apocalypsis, the revelation of Jesus when the Son of Man is revealed. That's talking about his return. He thereby teaches that unspeakably terrible wrath will come upon all the wicked as fire and brimstone sent from heaven when? On the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So that's when the wrath of God is poured out. And if this is not clear to you, if this is not convincing, he makes the same statement concerning the timing multiple times. And this is my difficulty again with all these pre-trib teachers. But all you have to do is read the immediate statements before and after these little quotes. This is so important, but again, revealed means appears. Every eye will see him. All flesh will see him. There's no secret rapture here. He will be revealed and all flesh will see him, as Isaiah says. And then Eusebius goes on to say in his commentary, he says that it will be the same at the end of the age. The cataclysm of destruction for the wicked will not occur until those men found to belong to God are gathered into the heavenly ark, in accordance with the example of Noah. To these this word of the prophet will be spoken. Go, my people, enter into your inner room until the wrath of the Lord passes by. That's Isaiah 26, verse 20. Now, just as in the time of Lot he acted so that the righteous did not perish along with the wicked, so at the end of this age this destruction will not take place till all the righteous and God-fearing men on the earth are separated from the wicked and gathered into God's heavenly ark. End quote. Again, he says that it will be the same at the end of the age. Okay, so now he's talking about the end of the age here in accordance with the example of Noah. To these, the word of the prophet Isaiah, go, my people, into your inner room until the wrath of the Lord passes by. Now, just as in the time of Lot he acted so that the righteous didn't perish, he says, just like it was in the days of Lot, the righteous were saved, the righteous did not perish along with the wicked. So at the end of the age, this destruction will not take place until all the righteous and God-fearing men of the earth are separated from the wicked and gathered through the rapture. He says the judgment of the wicked, the cataclysm that will befall the wicked, that will not happen until the rapture happens first. Okay, so what Eusebius is articulating here is a perfect post-tribulational, pre-wrath perspective. We get raptured, and then the wrath of God is poured out on the wicked at the very end of the tribulation. And to further drive home this point, he goes on to say in his commentary, and I quote, he says, "For when the summoning together of all things takes place along with the end of the world, and the form of this visible world passes away, it follows that there should be a transformation even of the heavenly lights. This will occur at the end of the age when the apostasy is in full effect. For when the Savior is about to come and abolish the false miracles of those fighting against God, certain preludes to his wrath will begin to occur through droughts and the deprivation of sound from the sea." He explains what comes after by saying the following, "For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. This will occur when the Son of God is established in glory and abolishes the insolent tyranny of the Son of Destruction, as the highest heavenly hosts fight at his side." End quote. So at the beginning of his quote here, Eusebius says, "For when the summoning together of all things takes place along with the end of the world." So when are we talking about? Obviously the end of this world. So that describes the end of this current wicked age. This is not just the end times in general, but he says the end of this world, the end of this wicked system, or the day of the Lord, also known as the second coming of Christ. Eusebius here takes the perspective that this whole entire current creation will be destroyed and then God will remake it. So just to be clear, he says this will occur at the end of this age when the apostasy is in full effect. And he goes on to say, "For when the Savior is about to come and abolish those fighting against God and the false prophet and basically judge the Antichrist and his followers." He says certain preludes to this wrath will begin to occur. So the point is very clear here. Eusebius is saying the wrath of God will be poured out after Jesus returns, not before. Okay, so you can't get around this point. The wrath of God is poured out after Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation to destroy and defeat the Antichrist. Eusebius continues to explain in his commentary. He says, "And he spoke to them a parable. Look, a fig tree. Likewise, when you see these things happening." What could these things mean other than what he had just said? The signs are the trampling of Jerusalem by the nations, the fulfillment of the times of the nations, the times of apostasy, the signs among the heavenly lights and stars. End quote. What comes after the powers of the heavens will be shaken? Then will occur that the Son of Man is established in glory. When does this happen? After Jesus returns, when he is established in glory, obviously. Okay, so this clearly happens after Jesus returns and destroys the Antichrist. That's when it happens, not 7 years before his visible coming, his appearing. Not some phantom invisible rapture 7 years before his coming that the Bible never describes. There is only one more glorious appearing from heaven. There is only one more coming of Jesus. The church has had all kinds of bad doctrine and theology over the years, and Eusebius taught replacement theology, which is wrong. But the church has always universally held that the church would face the tribulation, and that's exactly what Eusebius is saying here. Eusebius goes on, he says, "He gestured to his apostles and said, 'Surely this lineage will not pass away until all these things take place.' For he foresaw the new lineage of his holy church that would arise from and through them through the entire world. Indeed, he says that his people and church will remain and endure until that point in time when they witness all this for themselves and take in with their eyes the fulfillment of the Savior's prophecies." End quote. So he says indeed that his people and the church will remain and endure until that point in time when they witness all of this for themselves, which is what the trampling of Jerusalem, the apostasy, the cosmic signs, the fulfillment of the times of the Gentiles, and so forth. So Eusebius envisions who on the earth during the tribulation? The church. And he specifically says the wrath of God would be poured out when? After Jesus returns. The the wrath of God is poured out, he says, there'll be some preliminary signs, there'll be some preliminary wrath right before the return of Jesus, but it's not until Jesus actually comes back that the wrath of God is poured out. So in no way, shape, or form did Eusebius teach a pre-tribulational rapture. He taught that the church would be on the earth during and throughout the entirety of the tribulation. They are caught up just before the wrath of God is poured out, after Jesus returns. Okay, so the point is this. In terms of the timing of all this, there's simply no pre-tribulationism here. Now, pre-trib teacher Lee Brainerd claims to have found not one, not two, but 9 pre-tribulational statements in some of these fragmentary writings of Eusebius, but these statements are very easy to debunk. It's very easy, as we've just done here. Eusebius clearly believed that the church would face the Antichrist and that they would endure, they would remain and they would endure, and then Jesus would return, and then the wrath of God would be poured out after that. The tribulation period is not the wrath of God. Again, the wrath of God is expressed during the 7 bold judgments upon the wicked, and so many Christians seem to get this point wrong. Again, I just want to restate, I know I've said it 1,000 times, but you will not find a single early church writer who taught and believed a pre-tribulational rapture. This is a new doctrine, and you will not find this teaching anywhere throughout church history until you get to the Irvingites movement. Edward Irving was a Scottish clergyman in London, England during the 1830s, a time when pockets of England were in a period of prophetic expectation and excitement. So this group came along during the Age of Confusion at the same approximate time as the Jehovah's Witnesses showed up and Mormonism, these cultic Christian groups. And then John Nelson Darby picked it up shortly after the Irvingites were already teaching it. And then he ran with it with the help of Schofield. They spread it all over the world, all over the United States, and unfortunately, it is now arguably one of the most widely embraced unbiblical false doctrines in the church, and it's a dangerous doctrine. That's why we're taking the time to debunk some of these issues here, some of these pre-tribulational teachers trying to say that the church fathers and even the apostles taught this nonsense. So we've been looking at church history to demonstrate that from the beginning of the church right up until modern times, the only view concerning the rapture espoused within the church was a post-tribulational rapture. In some cases, you could say that you see elements of pre-wrath or post-trib, but what is absolutely clear is that the pre-tribulational rapture of the church was not taught. It was never widely believed until just recently after the influence of John Nelson Darby. We have been debunking some of the claims made by pre-trib teacher William C. Watson, not only in his book Dispensationalism Before Darby, but also the more recently released book called Discovering Dispensationalism, in which Watson contributes a chapter, and there he makes various claims concerning many of the early church writers, and so we're going to look at his claims concerning a man named Andrew of Caesarea. Andrew of Caesarea was an early church writer. He lived from 563 to 614 A.D. He was a Greek theological writer and bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia. His life spanned the late 6th, early 7th centuries. His principal work is a commentary on the book of Revelation. To be very clear, Andrew held to the majority traditionalist perspective throughout most of church history, which is to say he was an amillennialist. So he didn't believe in a literal future coming millennial reign of Jesus on the earth, but he believed that we are in the spiritual millennium now. But he was also a futurist, which means that he believed that the Antichrist, the Great Tribulation, and the last great persecution, and so forth, were yet in the future, just before the return of Jesus. Okay, so he was not a preterist. He didn't believe those things were all fulfilled back around the events of 70 A.D. So he was a traditionalist, and of course he was a post-tribulationist, which is to say that he believed the resurrection and the rapture happened at the end of the 3.5 years when Jesus returns at the second coming. So let's go ahead and just start. We're just going to read a couple of Watson's quotes whereby he claims that Andrew of Caesarea taught or espoused either a pre-tribulational or a mid-tribulational view. So I'm going to read both of his quotes here. Again, these are from the book Discovering Dispensationalism, Chapter 5. His first quote here, he says, "In the midst of the Great Tribulation, he, Andrew, expected that the rapture would take place in order to rescue the church from the woes that would befall the earth." Andrew of Caesarea wrote a notable commentary on the Apocalypse, with statements that would today be considered either a pre-tribulational rapture or mid-tribulational rapture view, end quote. In the midst of the Great Tribulation, he, Andrew, expected that the rapture would take place in order to rescue the church from the woes that would befall the earth. Okay, so with this statement in particular, he says it's in the midst of the Great Tribulation. Now, there are some definitions here that could easily confuse people. Traditional pre-tribbers teach that the final 7 years before the return of Jesus, all of that is the Great Tribulation. So if the believers are raptured at any time in the midst of that, they could be considered mid-trib, or they could be considered pre-wrath. But if you're raptured in the midst of the tribulation, well then, you are not pre-trib, right? But notice he says he believed that in the midst of the Great Tribulation. You might notice that Watson, who is a pre-tribber, never wants to say pre-wrath. He won't use the word pre-wrath because he doesn't want to give any credence to the position that is overwhelmingly winning many pre-tribulationists over. Many pre-tribbers, after they start studying the scriptures, they either become pre-wrath or post-trib or some mixture between the two. But notice that Watson, who doesn't want to draw any attention to this position that's winning so many devout, serious students of the Bible, he just says in the midst of the Great Tribulation and tries to infer that that means that Andrew was somehow pre-trib. Now again, that's nonsense. That statement is nonsense because again, from a pre-tribulational perspective, that would mean that Andrew taught that you're raptured 7 years before the second coming. That's what modern-day pre-tribbers teach. Or he believed that we would be raptured right in the middle of the 7 years before the coming of the Antichrist. That would be considered mid-trib. But once you say the rapture will take place after the middle of the tribulation, after the coming of the Antichrist, in the midst of the tribulation, that's pre-wrath. Okay, so really from Watson's perspective, Andrew of Caesarea was pre-wrath. But he doesn't want to say that, and he, in my opinion, very deceitfully says that he taught something that was pre-trib. But there's nothing in Andrew's statement that in any way, shape, or form could be misinterpreted to be pre-trib, not by modern-day definitions. So this is just another example of the sleight of hand of the deceptive card trick that when people read this, they say, oh yeah, Andrew of Caesarea was pre-trib. But actually, when you carefully read what Watson says, he says actually he made statements that today would be considered pre-trib. But was Andrew himself really pre-trib? See, this is the thing. Watson recognized that Andrew was clearly post-tribulational, but he finds a few or just a couple weird statements that he misinterprets as pre-trib. In other words, inferring that Andrew was contradictory in his views. Like he didn't really know what he believed, and therefore since he found a few quotes, a few statements, he says that he was pre-trib or mid-trib, neither of which is true. And the entire statement is actually rather manipulative and a bit misleading. So to be absolutely clear, Andrew of Caesarea was a post-tribber through and through. Clearly, arguably, he was not confused. He knew exactly what he believed. Let's just start out with the statement that Andrew makes in his commentary on Revelation in chapter 6. He says the following, "These things will come on the world at the coming of the Antichrist, as he is called. At that time the great men, whether those who hold office in the church and the churches of the faithful, they will flee from their places, changing from place to place on account of the false Christ." End quote. These things will come on the world at the coming of the Antichrist, as he is called. What are these things? all of the various trials and tribulations. Okay, again, the coming of the Antichrist. He says, at that time the great men, whether those who hold office in the church, in other words, the bishops, the pastors, the elders, and the leaders, he says those great men and the churches of the faithful, they will flee from their places, changing from place to place on account of the false Christ, on account of the Antichrist. So notice here that Andrew says that during the time of the Antichrist, that the leaders of the church and the churches themselves, specifically the churches of the faithful, they will survive by moving from place to place, by fleeing. So why was this a common idea in the writings of the early church fathers? Well, specifically because they looked at Revelation chapter 12, where you have the woman that is given the wings of a great eagle, and she's given a place of refuge in the wilderness. She's given a place of sanctuary. So many of the early church writers interpreted the woman there to be the church who is hiding, who has the place of refuge in the desert in a lonely place. And so they extrapolated from that, and they believe that during the tribulation, the saints will survive by moving from place to place and by hiding themselves in the desert and so forth. This was the common view in the writings of the early church. Now here's another statement from Andrew in Revelation chapter 11. He's talking about the New Jerusalem. He says that the holy city, whether that is the New Jerusalem or the Catholic Church, will be trampled by the nations for 42 months. Signifies, I believe, that at the appearance of the Antichrist, those who are faithful and trustworthy will be trampled and persecuted for 3.5 years. End quote. That the holy city, whether that's the New Jerusalem or the Catholic Church. Now, to be very clear, when Andrew says the Catholic Church, he's not referring to the Roman Catholic Church. He just means the Church Universal, to be very clear, because the official split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches occurred in the year 1055 AD. So this was centuries before the church split, when the Roman Catholic Church was sort of officially formed, so to speak. So he's not talking about the Roman Catholic Church, he's just talking about the church. He says the holy city, whether that symbolizes or represents the New Jerusalem, or essentially the church, he says the church again will be trampled on by the nations, by the Gentiles for 42 months. So again, Andrew believes that at the appearance of the Antichrist, those who are faithful and trustworthy will be trampled and persecuted for 3.5 years. Well, who is he talking about? He's talking about the universal church. When the Antichrist appears, the church will be trampled, and those who are faithful and trustworthy for 3.5 years will be persecuted. Andrew obviously was a post-tribber, and there's no getting around it. He makes clear, emphatic, direct statements. Now, as a scholar, why is it that Watson ignores statements like this and then tries to tell you that he was a pre-tribber or a mid-tribber? Because right here, Andrew clearly says the church will be persecuted throughout the full last 3.5 years. It's the last 3.5 years that is technically the Great Tribulation, right? So not only does Watson get it wrong, but again, once again, and we have seen this pattern consistent throughout literally every single of his claims, he ignores clear, direct, post-tribulation statements. He just ignores them, and then he points to the other statements and tries to infer or outright state that someone was pre-trib when they were not. It's just easy to demonstrate that it's just patently false. Here's another statement in Revelation 12. Andrew says, when the devil through the Antichrist in whom he works arrays himself for battle against the church, those in the church who are elect and preeminent will spit on the tumults of life and the desires of the world and flee into that desert devoid of every evil. End quote. Andrew says, when the devil through the Antichrist in whom he works arrays himself for battle against who? Against the church. Pre-tribulationism teaches that the church will be raptured to heaven before the tribulation, and that any of the saints or the tribulation saints, anyone who is saved during the tribulation, pre-tribbers call them tribulation saints. They actually say that they are not part of the church. They are some other body. They are some other class. They are not the one flock under one shepherd as Jesus taught. You can see how these religious cults try to divide the church where it shouldn't be divided. The saints are always the church in Scripture. You cannot divide the church into two separate groups like dispensationalism does. The Jehovah's Witnesses try to do the exact same thing and divide Christians into two groups, those that go to heaven, the 144,000, and those called the other sheep who supposedly will be living on the earth. And it's always these cults that try to do that. Here's another statement by Andrew of Caesarea in Revelation chapter 12. He says, "All of these things are symbolized by the wings of the eagle, and they were given to the church so that taking flight by them into the desert. To be sure, this occurs always, but it will especially be so at the coming of the Antichrist, who will rule everywhere. It is written for the designated time of 3.5 years." End quote. So the church is always fleeing from persecution. This is what Andrew sees. He says, but it will especially be so at the coming of the Antichrist, who will rule everywhere. He says the Antichrist is going to rule over all the earth. He says the Antichrist is going to rule all over the earth. It is written for the designated time of 3.5 years. This concept of fleeing from persecution, which Jesus actually says that when you're persecuted, flee to the next city. That's always been true, but it will especially be true during the 3.5 years that the Antichrist wreaks havoc against the church, as is mentioned here in Revelation chapter 12. Andrew goes on to say, since the orthodox teachers of the church and those who disdain the world retreat to the rigor of the desert, the Antichrist does not neglect them, but wages war. It says against those who struggle in the world for Christ. End quote. They will retreat to the desert, he says. Therefore the Antichrist does not neglect them, but wages war against those who struggle in the world for Christ. So whoever struggles for Christ, who hides themselves in the desert, the Antichrist will wage war against them. And here in Revelation 14, Andrew says, and so the body of the church will be united to Christ, our head. The eternal gospel, which from eternity was foreordained by God, says, fear God, but have no fear of the Antichrist, who cannot kill the soul with the body. Rather, fervently stand opposed to him who has power, but for a short time. End quote. So Andrew was saying, fear God, but have no fear of the Antichrist, because he can't kill your soul. He can't affect you eternally. He can kill the body. Don't worry about those who can kill the body. Rather, fervently stand opposed to him who has power, but for a short time. That's how the book of Revelation defines the gospel. Fear God, and don't fear those that can kill the body. Again, it's very, very clear the Antichrist will persecute the church, and what the church must embrace here, he says the church, the body of the church, is they must embrace the fear of the Lord in order to endure, in order to lay down and count their lives, their physical lives, as nothing. See, that's the spirit of the New Testament. That's the spirit of the New Testament as contained in the writings of many of the early church writers. Then in concluding his commentary on the book of Revelation, in Revelation 22, he summarizes this. Andrew says, the book of Revelation displays the persecution against the church, the downfall of the devil, the coming of the Antichrist, and the deceit of the false prophet. End quote. The book of Revelation, he says, it displays what? The persecution against the church, the downfall of the devil, the coming of the Antichrist, the deceit of the false prophet. Now our pre-trib brothers and sisters today will say no church after Revelation chapter 4, or even after Revelation chapter 3. The church has never seen that. It's just the tribulation saints who are the Jews only, and that the church is in heaven. No, Andrew says the entire book of Revelation, its principal focus is the persecution of the church by the Antichrist. As a post-tribber, I agree with Andrew of Caesarea on this account. So, as we've just seen, Watson unfortunately consistently ignores very clear post-tribulation statements. He never references one of these. He doesn't try to even bring them up. It's like they don't exist. That's certainly not fair to you as a reader. If you were listening to a scholar who is assessing the views and beliefs of Andrew of Caesarea, then honesty dictates that he would share these things with us and at least try to explain them. But he doesn't, because there's no way he can explain these away. Because they're so clear, therefore, he ignores them. So that's just downright sloppy or dishonest or both. Watson and Lee Brainerd unfortunately practice in what can only be viewed as dishonest editing in their writings to try to prove that the Church Fathers taught pre-tribulationism. Here's an example that I'm talking about here. The portions in pink are the parts of Andrew of Caesarea that Watson cites, and he includes it in the book Discovering Dispensationalism, and the portions in yellow are the part that he cut, and then he pieces the two pink statements together, and he says, look, Andrew was pre-trib, but he leaves out the yellow part. Let's look at this real quick again, beginning with the pink part. He says, the saints are caught up in the midst of the temptations, lest they be subdued by difficulties. Skipping down, he says, for in the 3.5 years are reckoned 1260 days, during which the apostasy will rage. During this time the great judge will not think to tempt us beyond what we're able to bear, so we'll be raptured in the midst of the difficulties, because the Lord doesn't want to put anything on us that we can't bear. He quotes that, and you say, oh, look, he might be some sort of pre-wrath, mid-trib type of thing. It's not pre-trib, but they basically claim pre-wrath and mid-trib as though it supports pre-trib somehow. So that's the part that Watson includes, but here's the part that he cuts out in yellow. I'm going to read that part in yellow. He says that they are subdued by the difficulties beyond their powers, and they will be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So it says the saints will be caught up in the midst of the tribulation. It doesn't say right in the middle, but sometime in the midst of the tribulation, that we will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air, and they will be with God in his throne, that is the most excellent of the angelic powers. So we, the church, will be caught up. Andrew says to God's throne, and then he quotes Revelation 12:6, the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God in which she will be nourished for 1260 days. Now here's the quote that we read earlier, when the devil, through the Antichrist in whom he works, arrays himself for battle against the church. 1260 days. During that time, the Antichrist will wage battle against the church. These in the church and the elect, who are preeminent, will spit on the tumults of life and the desires of the world. They will spit on everything that this world has to offer. So they will flee into the desert where there's nothing but relying on God. They will say to all of the comforts, the pleasures, the promises, the dreams of this world, they will spit on them, and they'll flee into the desert to trust and feed from the hand of the Lord. He says they will flee into the desert devoid of every evil and the life that bears every virtue, as Methodius says. So now he's quoting the early church writer Methodius. He says there they will escape the assaults of both people and demons who war against them. It is likely that the physical desert will save those who flee from the plot of the apostate to the mountains and caves and holes in the earth, as was recently the case with some martyrs. So here's the statement where Andrew very clearly says, yes, the church will be caught up in the midst of the tribulation, but then he says at the end of the 1260 days, the Antichrist will wage war against them. But they will hide themselves, and it's the desert, it's fleeing that will save them. The fact that he cut this part out, which changes the meaning and the understanding of everything that he quotes, is dishonest. It's very deceitful. So this type of work is just very dishonest. We need to give people the opportunity to make up their own mind. Anything else is just dishonest. So as we begin to wrap up our assessment of Watson's book, I just want to put his statement, his claims, side by side with one of Andrew's statements. So William Watson says, in the midst of the Great Tribulation, he, Andrew of Caesarea, expected that the rapture would take place in order to rescue the church from the woes that would befall the earth. End quote. Now here's what Andrew says, Revelation 11. The Catholic Church will be trampled by the nations for 42 months signifies, I believe, that at the appearance of the Antichrist, those who are faithful and trustworthy will be trampled and persecuted for 3.5 years. Now, does that sound like Andrew believed in a pre-trib rapture? Absolutely not. Watson claims, he says, in the midst of the Great Tribulation that Andrew of Caesarea expected that the rapture would take place in order to rescue the church from the woes that would befall the earth. And then Andrew here, he says the Catholic Church will be trampled by the nations for 42 months. He doesn't believe the church will be trampled for half of the 42 months. He says the church will be crushed underfoot by the Antichrist for 3.5 years. He says, I believe that at the appearance of the Antichrist, those who are faithful will be trampled and persecuted for the full 3.5 years. Okay, so it's very clear when you compare these two statements that Watson was not accurately representing Andrew of Caesarea's position honestly, and anybody can see that. So we can see how a lot of these pre-trib authors and writers try to do anything to prove their point by misrepresenting what the church fathers have had to say on this subject. Okay, I'm going to end this video here due to time constraints. In conclusion, though, we can see how some of these pre-trib teachers are very sloppy in their work, trying to prove that the church fathers were teaching a pre-trib rapture when they obviously were not. In my next video, we will continue to look at a few more of these false claims by some of these pre-trib teachers that dispensationalism existed before John Darby invented it in the 1800s. So stay tuned for that, and as always, thank you very much for watching.